用声音
碰撞世界，
生动活泼。
嗨，大家好，欢迎收听声东击西，我们一起用对话来发现更大的世界。我是徐涛。今天我们的嘉宾是美国历史学家和传记作者凯伯德 Bird， 他是奥本海默这本传记的作者。如果大家还记得今年夏天大热的同名电影《奥本海默》，那这个电影就是基于他这本传记改编而成的。那我其实更加愿意这样去描述他，他是一个从小在中东长大的美国外交官的儿子，一个经历了复杂冲突和战争的观察者，一个通过传记写作去探究历史的作家。那他今年其实已经72岁了，写了7本传记，现在第8本传记还在写作中。他有告诉我说，他所有的写作都有一个共同的主题，那就是美国的权力究竟是如何运作的。包括《奥本海默》这本书也是如此。其实我对他的好奇也是在于他究竟如何通过一本本的传记来探索这一个非常宏大的主题的。毕竟美国权力的运作事实上影响了整个世界。为了方便大家收听，本期节目制作了中文翻译和英文原声2个版本。你即将收听到的是英文原声版本。凯伯德会对美国权力如何运作这个主题感兴趣，也许可以追溯到他的童年。我们可以从他到达耶路撒冷那年开始说起，那是1956年，凯伯德4岁。
I was only 4 years old. Father was a Foreign Service officer, a diplomat, and this was his first assignment overseas in a foreign post, and they sent him to Jerusalem. He had grown up in a small town in Oregon. He loved to travel and was big on adventures, and so he thought this was a terrific thing to be posted to Jerusalem. It was a much smaller city, almost a small town. And we lived in very close to the wall, Damascus Gate. At the time, it was a divided city. Half of it was under Israeli control and half of it was under Jordanian control, the Hashemite kingdom. And we lived on the east side of Jerusalem, in the Arab part of the city. And for a time, I went to school in West Jerusalem, in the Israeli-controlled. And every day I would therefore go back and forth through Mandelbaum Gate, which was the only sort of checkpoint between the east and the west parts of this divided city where only diplomats could travel back and forth. So I sort of saw both sides. Soon after we arrived, a war broke out. The Suez War of October 1956.
This was the chaotic state of affairs in Port Said Harbor when
we were evacuated to Beirut with my mother and my younger sister, and my father had to stay behind, work in the consulate there. So one of my earliest memories as a child is of being in Jerusalem and then being whisked away suddenly to Beirut and being separated from my father.
但他其实也观察到中东犹太人和阿拉伯人有过相对和平相处的时光。他后来会用多元文化马赛克来形容这种共存的状态。他童年就有过一个好朋友，父亲是巴勒斯坦人，母亲是犹太人。
was Jewish. Yeah, that's true in part. You know, back in the 19th century, there was a small Jewish population, very small, in Jerusalem and other parts of Palestine. And Palestine itself was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a mosaic. It was very multicultural, Armenians and other different kinds of Christians and Greek Orthodox and Jews and Muslims. And then when Zionism as a movement got started at the turn of the 20th century, it stimulated more and more immigrants from Europe largely. Even in the 1920s and 30s, the growing population of Jews who immigrated was causing tensions. Still, there were interactions, and they lived in the same cities, and it was still a very multicultural mosaic like it was during the Ottoman Empire. But then the Holocaust happened in Europe and Nazi Germany, and the Shoah, where 6 million Jews were slaughtered by the fascists in Germany. The survivors of this terrible experience, some of them immigrated to America and Argentina and elsewhere, but many of them ended up in Palestine. And these are wounded people, who are refugees from a terrible Holocaust, a massive pogrom. There was every reason for them to escape from Europe. What they have done is, in Zionism, the Zionist movement has succeeded in creating a new national identity. It's called Israeli. And it's true, largely sort of a culture drenched in Judaism and the Hebrew language. So, one of the mythologies was that Israel was a new land created. The Israelis claimed that they were merely coming home after 2,000 years. But in fact, there were Palestinians, Arab families that had been farmers and merchants who had lived there for hundreds of years. The Israelis seemed to not see. And yet, ever since, they have not been able to find some kind of peaceful relationship with their Palestinian neighbors.
只是在当时还是孩子的凯伯德眼里，这一切都非常让人难以理解。
And what was going on, I just knew that these were two different peoples who looked different and spoke different languages.
他的父亲后来先后被派往了中东不同的国家，那凯伯德也因此先后在这些国家度过了自己的童年和青春期。除了经历了巴以冲突之外，他也去了沙特阿拉伯，见证了美国是如何帮助这个国家建立了沙特阿美这家石油公司，并且彻底改变了这个国家的面貌。也经历了埃及国父纳赛尔作为泛阿拉伯民主主义领袖的统治时期。如果说中东这些国家的纷争让他感到困惑，那后来回到美国，其实美国也让他感到困惑，并因此想要做更多的探究。
Well, yes, I had an odd childhood. I grew up as an American in Jerusalem and Beirut and Saudi Arabia and Cairo, and then I finished high school in India, and I go back to America to go to college, to university. I'm kind of an odd person. I'm obviously American, but I realized I was an expatriate. I was a foreigner. I came back to America in 1969, and at a time when the war in Vietnam was still raging.
Pursuant to the executive order,
I was 18 years old. I had to register for the draft, and it seemed crazy, and it seemed a waste. Many young American men were dying, and millions of Vietnamese. And yet the war was being prosecuted in America by actually a liberal foreign policy establishment, of which John McCloy was noted as the chairman, informally. And McGeorge Bundy was Kennedy's and Johnson's national security advisor. And he was a former dean at Harvard University, a liberal. And I couldn't understand how these liberal intellectuals had dragged America into this senseless war.
所以他开始成为了一名记者，一个作家。那上面他提到的那些大人物，包括约翰·麦克洛伊，都成为了他研究和书写的对象，也成为他了解美国权力运作拼图中的一个部分。
As a biographer, I chose to write about powerful, influential people from America's elite, to figure out how power works in America, how power works in this complicated democracy. So that's why I chose these powerful men, McCloy and Bundy and Robert Oppenheimer. Because if you explain their lives, you're explaining how powerful interests in America exert their influence. That's a fascinating story. So my first biography was of a man named John J. McCloy,
Mr. McCloy adds,
who was an influential Wall Street lawyer, representing many big corporations and oil companies and other interests.
as John J. McCloy resigns as head of the World
He
Bank.
sort of symbolized the American foreign policy establishment, this elite group of largely men at the time in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who ran U.S. foreign policy. The advisors to various, all the presidents from Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s all the way to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But he always, he exercised his influence from behind the scenes. He wasn't very well known to most Americans. He was well known to elites, places like the Council on Foreign Relations, but he had an incredible number of jobs and advised every president through, for 50 years on how to run U.S. foreign policy. And by writing about him, I was able to tell a lot of history about World War II, the 1950s, and he became sort of the chairman of the American foreign policy establishment. So it's a wonderful story about his political and personal odyssey, but it explains a lot about U.S. foreign policy and the history of the Cold War through which he lived.
这本书的某些细节也的确成为他童年在中东所经历冲突的一些注脚。例如他写到1968年，其实麦克洛伊曾经花了3周的时间访问了中东6个国家，并且在利雅得私下会见了当时的沙特国王费萨尔，要求他能够尽可能的参与到解决阿拉伯国家和以色列的冲突中来。那当时沙特国王费萨尔经过了一番犹豫，其实是提出了一个复杂的妥协方案，看起来是可以实现真正的和平的。带着这个方案，麦克洛伊在之后的10天又见了侯赛因国王、黎巴嫩总统以及纳萨尔。但当麦克洛伊回到美国国内，向国防部长和国务卿做了汇报之后，得到的回答却是说，现在美国正在总统选举年，那在美国总统选举年，美国是不可能发起广泛的和平倡议的。麦克洛伊非常的失望，他后来在一封信中是这样写道：一个简单的事实，我们的以色列政策并不符合我们在中东的国家利益，我们应该反对犹太复国主义的野心。这个问题简而言之是以色列的扩张，我相信这种野心长远而言对以色列的国家利益也是阻碍。
My last biography was on Jimmy Carter, the president, who is now 99 years old and in hospice care.
那这本传记是出版于2021年。其实早在1990年的时候，凯伯德就写过一篇关于吉米·卡特的封面文章。但写完这篇文章之后，他突然意识到，他并没有完全理解吉米·卡特这一位美国内战后第一位来自南方的总统。
Because I didn't understand the South, I realized it seemed like a foreign country. They spoke a different language, different accent. I didn't understand their views of race to African Americans. They had a completely different narrative about the Civil War. I didn't understand their view of that history. I didn't understand their religion, Southern Baptists, evangelical Christians.
直到2015年，凯伯德才拿出时间去了解卡特的家乡南乔治亚州，然后他在那儿待了整整6年，去了解不同的文化和政治，以及为什么吉米·卡特会这样被误解。
He's regarded in America today still as a failed president. In fact, in his 4 years in the White House, he was rather successful. He passed a lot of legislation. He normalized relations with China. He negotiated the Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt. And those accords brought a sort of cold peace to the Middle East that has survived to this day. Israel and Egypt have diplomatic relations, but they haven't been at war since 1973. Yeah, he had a lot of accomplishments, but he was also sort of on a tipping point in American history from a liberal era to a more conservative. His successor was Ronald Reagan. He was defeated for the presidency in 1980 by Ronald Reagan. And it was fascinating to learn why this happened. So again, biography is, when it's done well, it's a vehicle for explaining and conveying a lot of complicated history.
因为他每一本传记都要写上数年甚至是十几年，也因此凯伯德对自己每个作品的选择都是非常的谨慎。某种程度上，每一本传记都是他探寻美国权力运作之谜中的其中一篇。
As a biographer, I have to be very careful how I choose my next subject, because I know I'm going to be spending years on this. And biography it's a very personal story, so you're always worried that you're missing the key anecdote or colorful story that explains the larger life. So you have to have an immense curiosity, even an obsession with learning what happened to this individual.
那奥本海默这本传记其实也花费了他漫长的时间，而且写作的视角其实带有他明显的个人好奇在其中。
My book on Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, I wrote with a co-author, Martin Sherwin, who alas is no longer with us. He died at the age of 84 in October of 2021. But Marty started this book in 1980. And spent 20 years researching and then finally came to me and suggested that I join him on this project. And eventually I did, and it still took another 5 years to write and finish the book and get it published. So biography is an arduous, long quest to tell the story of another human being, and it can get very complicated. And however, you're also trying to craft a story. You're a storyteller. You're sort of writing a novel about another person, but with footnotes, with sources. So my Oppenheimer biography is my and Marty's story about Oppenheimer's life. It's not Oppenheimer's story. He would probably tell it in a different way if he was writing a memoir. Yes, it is the job is sort of putting together a giant puzzle and finding out what fits together. But it's also a subjective process. There's nothing objective about biography. It is my view, and I come to the story of Oppenheimer or John McCloy or McGeorge Bundy with my own prejudices and bias and my own interests. So there are multiple biographies of Robert Oppenheimer, and they tell his story from a different perspective. And that's why we need many biographies of the same person, because that way we get a multifaceted picture of the history.
而在凯伯德眼中，奥本海默是这样的。
Oppenheimer, in my view, he's always a mystery, and that's what makes him interesting. And in the biography, Marty and I try to explain a little bit about what he's doing with quantum. But we're not quantum physicists. There's not much science in my biography of Oppenheimer, because that's not what really interested me about him. What interested me was his larger personal journey, both in terms of his personal life, his loves, his marriage, his personal odyssey, but also his politics. And then the fact that he represents this atomic age that we are all living in. We can't uninvent the atomic bomb. And it's a dangerous thing that he invented. but he had to do it. You know, Christopher Nolan in his wonderful new film called Oppenheimer has said that Oppenheimer was perhaps the most important man who ever lived. That's a pretty broad statement, but it has a truth to it. He's the most important man who ever lived because he completely changed the world and gave us a world that was capable of ending all civilization.
在3个小时的电影中，导演克里斯托弗·诺兰其实是尽可能地展现出了奥本海默作为一个科学家、作为一个爱人和作为一个能够影响世界的人的复杂度。但在凯伯德的传记中，其实有更多的细节展现了奥本海默所面临的困境以及他性格的复杂度。
Oppenheimer is stuck in a paradoxical problem. He has to invent this terrible weapon of mass destruction, and yet he's painfully aware of the consequences ethically, and he worries about this. And yet, you know, later in his life, he was sometimes asked if he ever regretted what he had done, and he always dismissed the question. He only visited Japan once. He never went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so he never saw the destruction that he had wrought. But when he arrived at Tokyo Airport, of course, this was a news event, and a throng of reporters, Japanese reporters, were waiting for him. They asked him, you know, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you have any regrets about what you did? And his response was very enigmatic, very elusive. He said, well, all I can say is I have not slept any worse or better last night than I did the night before. So he would never admit to regrets, but, you know, the biographer discovered that his wife, Kitty Oppenheimer, had written letters in August of 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, writing to a friend saying, you know, I'm terribly worried about Robert. He's plunged into a deep depression, and I don't know if he's going to make it, you know, implying that maybe he would end his life because he was so depressed over what had happened. So clearly he did have regrets, and he worried about it, and he was uncomfortable with being called the father of the atomic bomb.
当然，奥本海默的故事也依然是一个美国权力运作的故事，只是这个故事更具体地讲述了一个改变世界的天才如何被卷入了政治，想要发挥自己巨大的影响力去影响权力，但最终在权力斗争中被碾压。
He was also quite willing to use his celebrity status, his fame, influence politicians and the president and senators and generals. He enjoyed having that kind of access to power and to be able to walk the halls of the Pentagon and walk into the White House and see the president of the United States and advise him about nuclear weapons. He wanted to use his influence. And he thought it was important too. You know, access to power is a seductive thing. But at the same time, he worried all the time about the consequences. He is trying to explain to the world, we need to do something now that we have ushered in this atomic age. We need to control this technology. We need to ban atomic weapons and create an international regime of controls and inspections, and make sure that no laboratory, no factory anywhere in the world is enriching uranium or processing plutonium to be able to make bombs.
Science has profoundly altered the conditions of man's life.
But the politicians in America, Harry Truman and then Eisenhower and others, ignored this advice. Instead, we engaged in an arms race with the Russians.
To make significant decisions.
That's the real tragedy of Oppenheimer.
Continents of knowledge, the future of science.
That's the other aspect of the story that is so fascinating, is that he became a sort of modern Prometheus, like the Greek god who was supposedly stole fire from Zeus and gave it to mankind and then was punished by Zeus. So in the same way, Oppenheimer stole atomic fire from the heavens, so to speak, and gave it to, in the first instance, Harry Truman and other politicians. And then 9 years later, after being celebrated as America's most famous scientist and a symbol of the scientific age, 9 years later he was punished, like Prometheus was punished by Zeus, and humiliated in this kangaroo court that took place at the height of the Joe McCarthy witch hunts in 1954. It's a tragic story, which is illustrative of both America's politics and the larger atomic age.
就像凯伯德所写的传记帮助我更多地理解了巴以冲突一样，奥本海默事实上也能够帮助我们理解一些当下。毕竟最近1年 AI 技术快速发展，我们这个世界看起来也正在彻底地被这个新技术所改变。
Sam Altman and the other developers of AI are openly talking about how this is another Oppenheimer moment, a moment in time where scientists are trying to puzzle about what they should do with this revolutionary new technology, AI, that obviously is going to change our world in dramatic ways. In my opinion, I think everything I've learned from history, from writing biography, is that we need to have more interaction, more global exchanges. We need more internationalism. We need to find ways to adapt this technology, whether it's AI or nuclear weapons. We need to have forums where we work out agreements to resolve these issues rather than engage in shouting matches.
但人们似乎很难从历史中获得教训。在凯伯德72岁的人生里，新技术给人们带来的困境从核武器变成了 AI， 而巴以冲突还在继续。
We're still living with this conflict, which essentially began 100 years ago or more, given the fact that there have been 3 wars, 4 wars, and many other violent incidents of terrorism over the years. There's too much hatred, too much division to imagine these two people living in one state, one political entity together. So the logical solution is a compromise, but we're a long ways from affecting this obvious compromise. It's amazing that we can't learn from history.
但不管怎么样，凯伯德现在依然还是在探索和书写历史。
I spend so many years on biography. It's such a wonderful vehicle for explaining history. And history is contentious. You know, everybody has different opinions about what took place. But we human beings, we can't understand our way in the world without putting it into some kind of historical context. We need to, understand how Shanghai was built and where it came from. Those stories are important to understanding our own lives.
他有提到自己正在写的一本传记。
My next biography is about a man named Roy Cohn.
某种程度上，这本传记也能帮助我们看到奥本海默那个时代更多的细节。但更加有趣的地方是，它可能会帮助我们了解另外一个在美国政坛上翻云覆雨的人物——特朗普。因为这本书写的主角罗伊·科恩是深刻影响了特朗普的人。
Trump's behavior as a politician, his ruthlessness, his divisive politics, his willingness to tell the big lie, his willingness to always double down, and his willingness to countersue in the courts, all came from Roy Cohn.
当我问他还有多久我们可以读到这本传记时，他说
at least 2 or 3 more years, maybe 5, I don't know.
那这就是我们今天的节目，欢迎你在我们的评论区留下留言，我们下次节目再见。
节目的最后，我们想邀请更多的朋友加入我们的生动胡同会员计划，成为我们的付费会员，支持新一年的内容创新。点击节目详情中的文章链接，看看生动活泼在2023年做了哪些有趣的探索，以及2024年的新计划，期待你的加入。